Hi, I'm James McGuire, and on today's eSpeaks, we're talking about artificial intelligence governance, which is one of the most challenging areas in the tech sector. The job of AI governance is to manage a technology that's changing faster than regulations can be written. So how do we do it? To discuss that, I'm joined by Greg Whalen, CTO of Prove AI. Greg, good to have you with us today.
Good to be here. Thank you.
So there's no doubt, AI governance is a tough topic. Before we dive into that, can you give us a nutshell version of what Prove AI does? What is the company's core business?
Yeah, absolutely. So at Prove AI, our core sort of mission is to de-risk AI development, right? So there's lots of companies in that space, right? I don't think our the value that we're or the what we're trying to solve here is necessarily unique. I think this is a hot topic everywhere. It's how do we de-risk AI developments, right? What we do differently though is to focus on this as to something where we want to de-risk things without putting in processes and without putting in unnatural things that slow development down. Right. So our focus is to look at the history of software development and just note that, right, when we've talked about, hey, things are moving too fast, things are risky, which has repeated itself many times, right, in the world of cloud software development, open source software, data science and analytics, right? People keep saying, wait, things are going too fast. Let's slow everything down. And historically, it's never been the right solution. That's never what's actually happened. So, right, what our mission and what we think that our unique kind of approach to de-risking AI development, right, is basically to focus on something that's very developer focused and something where, right, over time we want to limit the amount of people involved in the process here, right, and focus on metrics, focus on getting the right listeners in place with the models that we're developing, and ultimately get to a place where we're all comfortable about what our AI development and what our models are producing, right? And not have to worry about calling unnecessary meetings and being all worked up about whether whatever they're doing is compliant, ethical, or simply the right thing, right? So I mean that's what our mission is. We do use a decentralized ledger under the hood, right, to unlock certain use cases that are very hard to do with traditional databases, such as third-party verifiability and things like that. And we think those are core parts of what we need to solve, right? If you have a full and complete vision of solving this sort of de-risking AI.
Sure. Okay, makes perfect sense. Certainly, companies do want to be moving as fast as possible at the same time balancing the need for regulation and governance, so we can get into that. But I think that the interesting thing about governance, the compelling, urgent question about governance is that obviously AI governance is a major challenge for companies for any number of reasons. I think privacy is an issue, security. I think sometimes staff members will input sensitive information into a large language model. That can be a security issue. But what do you see are some of the most difficult current challenges involving AI governance?
Yeah, absolutely. So I sort of have a high level view of what the actual challenge is, like the root cause. So like the one you gave is, well, how do we know that, like, training data, how do we know what its provenance is, right? How do we know if it's really data that we want to use or should use? Yeah, that's a horrendously difficult problem, right? And then if we go back and root cause, well, why are we even in that situation to begin with, right? Why are we even worried about that problem? Right. I think of a lot. The biggest challenge is the sort of the natural inclination to try to fit whatever processes people use today with software development to AI. Right. So, right, that the problem that you stated about data governance and data lineage that exists purely because that has worked perfectly well for traditional software development, like, and through today, right? It was that was probably the least amount of effort necessary to get a good result, right? And
Mhm.
it's because you didn't update data sets too often. And if you did update data sets, then, okay, you probably, it was probably less effort to have, a human review of something and perhaps a declaration, right? There wasn't really a need to actually, operationalize this in a way that's, that could remove people from the process. So,
Mhm.
right,
Mhm.
sort of bumping this up a level, right? That's actually the biggest challenge that I think people have is they're set in a way of thinking of LLMs are software, which they are. They are software.
Sure.
Um, However, there's an attempt to say, well, if they're software, shouldn't they conform to the ways that we've been governing software for the last 5 years, 10 years? right? And the answer is no. But they go through this process and they naturally come up with, well, we need a human review here, we need a workflow here, we need a sign off here, and
Right.
they create very complicated chains of stuff, right? That ultimately are not they're not ever going to support the speed of development that you're going to get beyond those one or two initial models, right? That you want to roll out, right? So we focus instead, like I was saying earlier about Prove AI, right? We focus on event collection. The idea is if you have granular enough data, like in terms of events, right? You collect events, you know that they're trusted, and storing them in the right place is as good, if not better, than a declaration or a sign off,
Well, let
right?
me,
So
if I may interrupt just one second, I guess it seems there's this very powerful, very quickly changing thing called artificial intelligence. You're saying it can be governed in a fairly limited way, without many meetings, without many cross communications among colleagues. It feels like some might say, without knowing all the details, that's a pretty hands-off approach to governance. Am I correct in here thinking that?
yeah, yeah, yep, and that sounds scary, right? It
Right,
absolutely
it
sounds
does. Yeah,
scary.
for sure.
Right, right. However, right, I like to just draw the parallels with cloud software deployment and like when we go back to the Web 2.0 era, right, trying to do a single deployment, right, scaring. Like I remember, operating in this world where we would say, what we need to do? We need to do two deployments a week, and everybody would lose their mind and say, no, that's way too dangerous. How are you going to do that? We'd have to have spin up a whole compliance team just to look at everything you've done, like, and then be comfortable with the sign off. We'd have to do user acceptance testing. This is impossible. um there's so again, the solution that we've gotten to though is to get to a point where, yeah, the amount of information and the amount of automated testing, and the amount of certainty and confidence you can get to with high observability systems has given us the confidence to do thousands, if not tens of thousands of releases of software, each week. So, we're not saying remove humans from the process entirely, right? That would be dangerous, right?
Right.
What
I
what
hope
we're
so. Yeah.
saying, I guess the philosophy is here is to let's not make complicated. There's no reason for people to spend their days looking at outputs of stuff when you could easily just program in checks and balances,
Uh-huh.
right, for these things to automate this and get us to a point where we're very specific about what's okay, what's not okay, very specific about what our criteria are and our threshold for acceptable and not acceptable, and being able to handle the exceptional events and shut things down and roll back to previous known states, which is exactly what we do with traditional software and pipelines today.
Well, all right. On that note of automation, I think it brings us naturally to the point that, given that AI supports automation, should we expect a shift toward automated governance? Perhaps we will exist in a world where humans barely need to touch it, and in fact, the governance process, such as it is actually totally automated. Does that world ever will that world ever exist?
Yeah, so that's it. I believe so. I believe it has to, because otherwise, we're going to spend way too much time, and effort with people in roles that simply, are designed to sort of approve things that probably the amount of information they would have to look at, right, wouldn't actually be possible for a person to reasonably, approve of, right? So things like take the data set, piece before that you brought up, right? So does this, 3 petabyte data set contain any information that we should use, right? You could imagine a workflow where we say, man, we should just have somebody who decides whether this information is acceptable or not, right, and can sign off on its use. Yeah, so we don't think that that's ever going to work as data sets continue to get bigger and they become harder to sift through with more and more inputs or columns, if that's what you want to call. So,
Hmm.
right, this is an example where, at some point it's going to be impossible for an individual to make a clear yes or no, this is okay, this is not okay decision by looking at a single artifact. And that's what much of compliance, is about today. It's about looking at artifacts and deciding whether, the artifacts examined exhibit sufficient controls, right, that follow either standards, whether they're an internal standard or an external standard.
Hmm.
So you say, well, logically, if we're going to have immense data sets that, are very hard to trace. We're going to have non-deterministic LLMs, right? Not completely deterministic LLMs, or at least their determinism is very hard to fully test, right? Then
Sorry to interrupt. Could you explain what do you mean by deterministic or non-deterministic large language model? Could you
yeah,
explain what
sure.
that means?
Sure. It just means how certain are we that do we know every possible output, right, from these models, right? So
Okay.
traditional software, right, you can build in a relatively finite number of test cases where you're sure that you have full coverage or mostly full coverage of every possible output, right? And you know that because the software you've written is very clearly deterministic, right? It's very there's a very clear analysis that a human can do to say that I am confident that we have full testing of this software code,
Hmm.
right? Because
Hmm.
it's clear what it does from top to bottom. Yeah, when you have billions of neurons, right, in an LLM, right, the only thing that you've been able to observe with your LLM is the input data and things like the number of parameters, the prompt, right, and the overall sort of how the LLM itself works. The problem is that there's no way that you can have complete certainty that if you give a question A, that it's always going to give you, acceptable answer B,
Right.
right? There's too many issues where, you'd have to build so many test cases out to be completely sure of how this model is going to function, that there's always going to be some non-determinism here, where non-determinism simply means is I can't predict the output, meaning, test case A does not give me confidence that I have 90%, test coverage. That's
Hmm.
what I mean there.
Well, let's delve into the world of agentic AI. It feels like agentic AI is the hot topic within artificial intelligence these days. So, what about agentic AI and governance? Are these virtual workers supporting governance, or do they create their own governance issues?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think they make it harder. I think they make their own governance issues, and I think they make governance more difficult. So I mean, especially as we empower and link these agentic AIs, right? So if we step back and just say, let's take very basic examples of agentic AI, like let's take something like, I've built a customer support application, and maybe a very advanced one, or you might rely on separate agents to do things like resetting a password, providing a refund, doing sentiment analysis, right? And these are all semi-autonomous in that right, they can take action. They're empowered to take actions on behalf of a customer,
Right.
right? But in even a relatively small number of them, let's say five of them, you get into all sorts of unexpected challenges, like, well, how do we know that this agent is really talking to this other agent that I've actually authorized them to talk to, right? How do we know that there's a clear chain of trust between agent A and agent B? What happens if there's a mistake? What happens if there's some sort of attack and right, different agents start talking to, or masquerading as other agents out there, right?
Sure.
How
Right.
do I,
The
this
rogue agentic
exactly like a
actors.
road
Right.
agent, right? And these get this starts to become a real problem if we imagine that agents aren't necessarily all provided by the same person, right? So, like in the customer support example, maybe there's a specialized agent. I outsource it to a third party who's very good at sentiment analysis, right? And that's part of my solution. But I've then told my agent to trust this agent over here, right? How can these agents then autonomously determine and be sure that yes, I am talking to the agent I'm supposed to be. I'm supposed to be using outputs from this agent, right? And then what happens when something goes wrong? How do I trace back and figure out who actually made the error,
Right.
right? Was it
Right.
agent A? Was it agent B? Am I going to rely on multiple kind of people looking through logs, or am I going to want this written like to a decentralized ledger in a central place, a single, a factual source of truth that multiple parties can go to and say, aha, the problem is sentiment detection went off and it triggered a whole bunch of events that mishandled this customer's issue, right? Or was it, nope, there was a refund sort of processor over here that, that used erroneous logic, right, to basically trigger some action, but it wasn't prompted right incorrectly. You get all of these things that start to be real problematic, when introducing multiple agents that each are supposed to be the best at their job, right, and have more autonomy than they did previously.
Right. Right. Well, I think that and to wrap up our conversation, I think one of the biggest issues, the most pressing issues is all the companies that are now developing AI apps, and they're working with large language models. I mean, that's a lot of new development. Companies going in new directions. How does that impact AI governance?
Yep, yep. So yeah, like the last example, it just makes it harder, right? More parties are involved, and right, we can expect then that there's going to be more desire, like for cross collaboration and the selling of AI-driven solutions to third parties, right? So this has always been always a challenge, right? But typically, still in today's world, a lot of AI-powered solutions are still solutions, right? I don't buy in many cases, I don't buy a model from a third party, right? I buy a solution from a third
Right,
party
right. That sits on top of that model.
that sits on top of it. It has SLAs, it has known behaviors. Everything about it is, there are guarantees given to me.
Right.
When you have this sudden surge of interest in companies either developing or working with, LLMs and models, what you can expect them is there's just going to be multiple parties in the picture. So, what happens then is, well, how do I know that the model that I've bought from party A doesn't include data that I personally don't want my organization to use? How do I know that when they change something that I can be alerted of it? And how do I know, since the blast radius is particularly big, right? A small change to their model could in theory create a huge, could trigger a whole bunch of bad answers on my end,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
That open me up to liability, right? How do I solve those types of problems, right? Because ultimately, if it's my solution, I'm on the hook. It doesn't, right? Under today's legislation, right? It doesn't really matter where I bought the LLM from, right? It's still my solution, and thus I'm accountable and liable for anything that it does,
Hmm.
right? So
Hmm.
you can imagine examples in industrial use cases, maintenance types of things, automated sort of maintenance manuals where I buy an industrial product from party A, they have a sort of maintenance chatbot that they provide to me. I have thousands of workers that rely on that documentation to do preventative maintenance, right? I mean, what happens then if I start buying a model from these sort of third parties to do my own predictive maintenance, right? And suddenly either bad information gets in um, or it becomes configured the wrong way. Like, what happens if one of my people actually get hurt or they do the wrong type of thing
Right.
to an industrial machine because of a decision that was built on a model that I purchased from a third party, right? Very
Sure.
tricky things that get involved, but this is exactly the type of stuff that will come out as more companies develop and sell, AI solutions. It just gets more hard.
Hmm. Greg, I think you said it. It's a lot of good stuff. It's certainly going to be a fascinating area to follow. I mean, there's so many issues involved with AI governance. Thank you for sharing your expertise today, and I hope you come back and talk with us again sometime.
Absolutely. Likewise. Thank you for your time. Appreciate it.